Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and today I'm speaking to Kirk Nurmi. Does that name sound familiar? He was the public defender for Jodi Arias, and he is the author of a trilogy of books called Trapped with Ms. Arias, From Getting the File to Being Ready for Trial. And I will tell you, I had some apprehension about interviewing Mr. Nurmi. I wasn't sure how I felt about a memoir, a tell-all memoir from a lawyer about their client. I wasn't sure if that, I was sure that breached confidentiality, but I wasn't sure if that was okay. And Kirk agreed to hash that out with me and to let me ask that. And I was quickly relieved to learn why he had to write that book. And I do think he had to. And that will become clear in the conversation. I don't think he was left with much of a choice, and that experience was so overwhelming and consumed so much of his life. He had very little options at the point where he started to write the story, and that kind of weaves into his personal life too, and we get into that as well. But the title, Trapped with Ms. Arias, really, there was probably nothing else he could call that. He truly was. There was no getting out of it. He definitely tried. So we talk about that too in terms of being a public defender and why you can't step down from a case or pass. Just not how it works. But Kirk is in a much different place in his life now, and it was just great to hear that evolution of kind of how dark it got for him, and now he is on the other side. And I won't share too much because I want you to listen to the interview and hear the details, but he was just incredibly kind, generous with his time and his answers, and I enjoyed our conversation very much. And if this was a case of interest to you, you should definitely check out his book. And also, he is now a writer of wellness and self-help books, and I'm going to link to those in the show notes as well. He does a lot of work around that after his own fight with cancer, which you'll hear about in the conversation. So I want to thank Kirk Nurmi for his time, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you, Kirk, for killing the small talk. Kirk, thank you so much for being on Dialogue, a true crime conversation this evening.
Rebecca, thank you. It's nice to be talking with you this evening.
Likewise, thank you. So most people probably know your name, or they know you if they don't know your name. So your name is Kirk Nurmi, and you represented Jodi Arias in both of her trials, correct?
That is correct, and that is how most people know me.
Yes. So they probably a lot of people would know your exact name, and some people wouldn't. But if you said the lawyer who represented Jodi Arias, they have a immediate response, right? Because that was a trial we all followed and watched. And I maybe want to start there, though I want to hear a bit of your background. I like to talk about on Dialogue the true crime genre and how we interact with it and the entertainment aspect. And I'm always thinking that as a consumer of it and just as a human in the world, but I would think you would have thoughts on that from a legal perspective and how this affects trials and the process of a fair trial and law and legal issues. This intermixing of us now being able to be spectators of courtrooms is really interesting. I mean, we're all very interested and we want to watch, but is it okay? I don't know. I kind of want to start with that question to you. What are your thoughts on us being spectators of basically a day in the life of your job?
Sure. I think that's a great question and a fair one, and one that I think courts throughout the country and ultimately throughout the world are going to deal with to some extent, especially now. We have moved with our technology from, maybe having a single camera in the courtroom and a reporter talking about the events of the day in the evening news to being able to live stream a trial across the world. And for people to be able to consume that trial in real time, it makes the court of public opinion isn't just people watching the news at dinner at 5 o'clock. It's people all over the world. So the question is, yes, what effect does that have? Now, to get into the intellectual weeds, where there's the old psychological phenomenon of reactivity effect, right? You know you're being observed, you act a different way. That's
Right.
something that can't be measured, right? But one of the things that is of concern to me, and as a matter of fact, I recently wrote a op-ed about this, is what is the effect of these cameras in the courtroom beyond the immeasurable reactivity effect? Does it affect the sanctity of the trial? Does the trial become reality TV or a sporting event more than the pristine, if you will, function, a part of our democracy, right? That third branch of our government, does that affect its ability to function? And I don't know that there's a clear answer to that, but to me, my belief is that cameras need to be removed from the courtroom, just like the federal courts have done for years, so that we can ensure we're doing all we can to keep trials pristine and sacrosanct as they can be, as our Constitution dictates they should be.
Interesting. So whose ultimate call is it? Because in some cases we are in there and then others they're saying no cameras allowed. So is that a judge's determination, or is it a lawyer's fight to prevent it or to bring them in? Who wins that argument, for or against?
Well, it can be any of the above. Like with federal courts, as I believe I mentioned earlier, they have a per se bar on cameras in the courtroom, and certain states do as well. If you followed, for instance, the Weinstein trial, right, you know that there weren't cameras in that courtroom because New York did not allow them. Now, in my instance, for example, Arizona has rules regarding cameras in the courtroom that are designed to allow access while not diminishing the defendant's right to a fair trial. And so the Supreme Court of Arizona has laid out rules to that effect. And then in Arizona, at least it was the case back in 2013 and 2015, the court makes the decision, an individual judge makes the decision within those rules after hearing arguments from the media and from the trial attorney who presumably is seeking to keep the cameras out.
Oh, that's so interesting. So everybody has a real vested interest in that conversation and very different motives, what they're after, right? So, I mean, the media is always going to want to have as much access as possible because that's financially driven. And I would think, I mean, so what were your thoughts on it? I guess if you had a preference, it sounds like you would not want that to have all been televised.
Yeah, I mean, like I said in the op-ed that's coming out in a few days, I question the point of having cameras in the courtroom now. I question the validity of that because of what cameras are now, because they can be live streamed, because the court of public opinion is so strong and it breeds such fervor. It does and it can have an effect on a trial. And to me, the First Amendment is satisfied when we have reporters in the courtroom, when we have open courtrooms, but we don't have the disruption, the live streaming that can happen. And some of the things, we see trials now in what I call the social media era, right? Like Casey Anthony or Miss Arias' case, or maybe many others. And we see that the trials can become sporting events, reality TV, and that becomes a problem. But it isn't such a big of a problem. For example, in Harvey Weinstein's case, where certainly it was covered because he was a media mogul, he was a famous person going in, but I bet the coverage wasn't as extensive and the hoopla surrounding it wasn't as extensive as would be the case if cameras were in the courtroom.
Yes, I agree. And I also really find it interesting sort of which cases get everybody's attention and why some don't. And I specifically mean, I guess in the cases of murder, like a case like Jodi Arias's rises above so many others, right? And I'm curious what you think, why? What do you think the factor was in hers as compared to ones like it that just fall by the wayside for whatever reason? Why was this one, why were we all paying such close attention?
I get asked that question a lot, Rebecca, and one of my response typically is, you tell me, because I was in the eye of the storm. I wasn't watching the storm, right? I don't know why there was fascinations. I can speculate, a female defendant is unique, right? Facing the death penalty, that's unique. Some of the sexual aspects of the case. But, in the end, I'm just speculating. I'd really, because you're a true crime podcaster, tell me, what do you think? Why do you think she stood out compared to any others of similar nature?
I appreciate the touche. Because, you were just busy trying to do your job. The rest of us were making that difficult for you. So I think you're right. I think it's a female defendant. I talked to somebody last night, and I thought her insights on the same topic were interesting. She said, when there's a relatability factor, we tend to get more interested. That's just kind of maybe a selfish human nature thing. So now that'll be different for different people because we're a diverse group of people. But, middle class, relatively same kind of status, possibly age, race, you see yourself potentially in someone else. So I think for me, there's a fascination there. Like, wow, she's a woman scorned. I can relate to that, but the rest of it feels like a pretty big stretch. So what happened? I want to understand this, right? So I think there was that. And I think sometimes you can't escape when there's particularly bizarre details, which there were in this, you kind of do want to see it through to the end. And I think the female thing is big. I think facing the death penalty, overpowering a man, wondering if something is premeditated versus a response to a situation, which she later claimed it was. I think things like that you want to know and you want to understand, or I did. So I think that was part of it. I need to think more deeply. I need to turn the tables on myself more often. I appreciate that. But let's go back a little bit, and I want to hear kind of when you decided to go to law school, what you envisioned for your career, and then we'll kind of get to where you found yourself representing Ms. Arias.
Sure. I had kind of got the bug to be a lawyer since I was in grade school. I stumbled across a little picture book that I remember being called She Wants to Be a Lawyer. And, it was kind of one of these neat little picture books that really distorted reality, right? But it inspired me. It connected to my heart. And eventually, through a long series of events in 1997, I wound up entering the College of Law at the University of Wyoming. So my wife and I went to Laramie. She finished her education, and I got my law degree. And after that, graduated in 2000. I had some job opportunities, but this was about the time when the Phoenix area was starting to boom and really starting to grow. And my wife and I were able to get jobs down here really quickly. And so in 2001, after we moved here and I passed the bar, I started out my career as a public defender because that's what I went into law school wanting to do.
Okay.
I had connected a lot and believed very adamantly in the Bill of Rights and protecting the Bill of Rights and making sure that those rights are protected all across the board, whether a person is guilty or not. Those rights that we enjoy mean nothing if there are not lawyers that will stand up and fight for those rights in a courtroom. And that's what led me to the public defender's office.
And I think most people would, or I won't speak for most people, I hear that and I think that's so noble. It's so important. It's what any of us would want should we ever need an attorney. We are all guaranteed the right to a fair trial. And yet, public defenders can be demonized for representing people who have done horrible things, even though that person deserves to have a lawyer. So when you're a public defender, I'm wondering how much choice do you have in the matter of your clients? Are they completely assigned to you? Is it totally out of your hands, or do you have some say?
With the rare exception, they are completely assigned to you. I mean, it was a normal day in my life, might be, going to the office in the morning, coming back from court and having 5 new files, in my mailbox. And those were my cases. Those were my clients. And, it ranged from low-level felonies all the way up to serious felonies. And that's just the way it works. And you're right to reflect on the demonization, because I know in 2001, right, and I became a public defender and started connecting more with people in Arizona, meeting people, there was always that judgmental attitude when they found out what I did. How can you defend those people? And what people don't realize or reflect on anyway is the fact that those rights we're talking about is what somebody is defending. You're not, defending someone's conduct. The fact that a defense attorney is in a courtroom arguing that somebody is not guilty of a crime doesn't mean the defense attorney truly believes that, or like these common misconceptions that they're trying to get them off and they're trying to, make money and be the hottest lawyer that gets everybody off. That's not what it is. It's about defending those rights. It's not about the client. It's about the Constitution, is one thing that public defenders would say amongst themselves. And certainly my 15 years of criminal defense work really lends that to be true.
Okay, so by the time you get Ms. Arias as a client, you're 8 or 9 years into your career, or less?
Yeah, somewhere around that mark, because I moved to the Capital Unit. It's an exclusive unit. That's all you did in that area of the public defender's office. At that time in Arizona, Maricopa County specifically, there's a very high number of death penalty cases. So plentiful that they had to dedicate a unit just to that. So that is all we did. We had 2 or 3 cases. And in August of 2009, I can still remember my supervisor coming down the hall. My team had just finished a trial, which meant, we were due for the next case. And the empty file he assigned to me had the name Jodi Arias on it. And at 2009, I know a lot of people find this hard to believe because they think she's so notorious now, and she is now. But in 2009, she wasn't. She was just another name. And the only thing that really stood out to me when that file was handed to me was the fact that my client was a female.
Wow. And so from the get-go, she was a potential capital case. It was already like, this is going to be pursued as a death penalty case, and that's why it came to you?
Well, let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
So Miss Arias was arrested in 2008, in the summer of 2008. And she was assigned counsel. She was extradited from California. She did some interviews in California. She was extradited from California, did some more interviews, and had counsel assigned to her in Arizona. At that point in time, when she was brought to Arizona, it was already a death penalty case. Prior counsel, after having the case for about a year, withdrew from the case because of an ethical conflict, and that's why it came to the public defender's office.
Okay, got it. So now she's all yours, and the thing that stands out is she's a woman, violent crime, very violent crime. And can you talk about the first time you met with her and how that transpired, what all unfolded there?
Well, at the time, I don't want to get into specifics of the conversation, but keep in mind now, going back to the file, this empty file I had, right? The only thing I knew other than the female was that Miss Arias had done a interview, and I believe it was for CBS 48 Hours. So I watched that special, and it talked about the case, and it talked a little bit about their relationship and everything, and that's all I had. And also keep in mind, too, this isn't just me, right? We saw this at trial. There's a defense team. So we get together, we make contact with the client, and, a capital case is a long relationship type of thing, right? So it's not like you're going in there guns ablaze, and, you go in there, you introduce yourself typically, and address any immediate concerns, maybe making contact with the family, that sort of thing. Because like I say, you're in this for the long haul, and a death penalty case doesn't just involve a client. It's somebody's daughter or son or brother or sister, what have you. So you start kind of getting a sense of that and just kind of immersing yourself a little bit and hopefully building some trust between you and the client.
So it's such a big burden, right? A capital case is as major as it can be. The gravity of that is very real. So does your main intention just become getting that off the table or getting the jury not to choose the death penalty more than other layers of, I mean, is innocence even kind of on the horizon? Or is this more just about not getting to the death penalty?
Right. In a typical death penalty case, guilt is pretty much established before the state, the prosecution decides to go forward with death, right? It has to be fairly clear-cut case because it is a clear-cut nature of the case that they use to, advance the argument that this person should be put to death. So suffice it to say that probably the best way to answer your question is job number one of the capital defense attorney is to try to save their client's life. And there's different ways to do that. And one of them is saving their life at the sentencing with everything you do during the trial done towards the end of saving the life. Or the other thing is any conviction of a crime less than first-degree murder automatically takes the death penalty off the table. So there's two paths to that. And basically that is what a capital attorney is looking to do most prominently.
Okay, so how do you start thinking about her strategy and her defense theory of there being abuse, and this was her response to it in a heated moment? How did you feel about moving forward with that as part of the defense?
Well, let's back up a little bit, because keep in mind now, when the trial was first assigned to me and she did her interviews on CBS 48 Hours, if you recall, or some of your listeners will recall the fact that it was what came to be known as the ninja story, right? Do you remember that?
Right.
The idea that two people came in. Yes. That was her first story, that people came in and killed Mr. Alexander.
And let her
right?
go. Yes.
And let her go and what have you. Right. And so that changed obviously later in the ball game to more what we saw in the trial. But I don't want to go into the specifics of that conversation, but that was something that, in terms of, self-defense and that sort of thing, that I never believed. But the problem is, and what a lot of people don't understand, and this is why a lot of the hatred came my way, is that if a defense attorney, and this is kind of a Sixth Amendment right to fair trial, right to testify sort of thing, that the client gets to tell their story. The attorney can advise against it. The attorney can jump up and down and scream against it and do everything he or she possibly can to get that person to stop. But unless it can be proven definitively wrong, the attorney has to prove that story. And even if the attorney has definitive proof that the client is lying, the client still gets to take the stand and offer a narrative about what their story is, even if the attorney believes it to be false. He or she just sits there and watches. So what that means is, and Miss Arias's assertions about Mr. Alexander, about his abusive behavior and his pedophilic desires, were something, if you think about it, and I know a lot of people feel strongly, but it can't be definitively proven, right? It's you can't you can't prove a negative. That's the words I was searching for, right? You can't, prove a negative or disprove a negative. And it's like we see in, we had this Michael Jackson documentary come out a while ago, right? Yeah. We don't really know, right? People might have opinions and people might hoist their opinions to the field of fact, but it is still just an opinion, right? I'm not overly familiar. Maybe there's a great evidence to that regard. I don't know. But it cannot be definitively proven or disproven. And that's kind of the situation a defense attorney can find themselves in when a client makes claims that cannot be disproven.
Well, I can't think of anything more infuriating than how that must have felt to have to sit back and watch that happen. You know, it's so rare that a defendant takes the stand in their own defense, that they testify. So I think usually somehow the client understands that this could really negatively impact the outcome. Can you talk about why you think she was sort of just impervious to that advice and why she couldn't hear that?
Well, I think there's I guess I'd ask you to be a little more specific with your question. You mean in terms of her story or in
No.
terms of testifying in general?
Testifying in general, I assume you were very adamantly opposed. From what you're saying, you didn't really believe the story, but if you couldn't prove the abuse hadn't happened, you couldn't not allow her to do so. So what about her do you think, what about her wasn't able to hear that advice, in your opinion?
Well, I think there's a couple. I think there's a couple things that are getting conflated here, but ultimately, to say, when a client claims self-defense, they are almost put in a position to testify by default because they have to say that they feared for their life, and this is why.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
Right. So when you go to, a client who says, this is going to be my story, and this is why it's self-defense, then they put themselves, by the story, if they're going to stick to it, if you will, they put themselves in a position where the jury is going to want to hear why they thought their life was in danger.
Okay. So in that case, then you were, if not supportive, you were understanding that you had to do that. So maybe you weren't so adamantly opposed. You didn't express that.
Well, I don't want to get into the specific advice, but I will say this: I was adamantly opposed to some of the things that the assertion she was making. Let's put it that way.
Okay, that's fair. So, I mean, you end up, there's so much to get to because we have the conviction and then sentencing and a second trial.
Sure.
But at this point, how are you feeling and how is this trial impacting you? Is it a slow burn of a fire kind of building, or are you already like, this got away from me really quickly? Like, where are you at say by the time she's taking the stand?
Well, by the time she's taking the stand, obviously we'd become accustomed a little bit to the atmosphere of the trial, right? The fervor of the trial and the security measures we were taking, and the hypervigilance we had to conduct ourselves with throughout the trial because of the threats and that sort of thing. But look, I had tried to withdraw from this case several times. I left the public defender's office in 2011 thinking that I would leave the case behind, hoping I would leave the case behind, and fate didn't put me in that position. There I was. So really my goal, if you will, by that point in time, my mindset is, because I couldn't get off the case and wasn't going to get off the case in the middle of trial, definitely, was to just simply put my head down, do my job, try to stay safe, and get through the trial.
Now, when you say stay safe, is that because like public outcry, people are stalking you, threatening you? Like, what is happening to where you're feeling unsafe?
Yeah, I mean, the county allows for or mandates that people file motions with their address and their phone number, their business phone number, and their email address. So that allowed people to call my office and threaten me. It allowed people to email threats to me. It allowed people to mail things to me. I mean, I remember getting white powder in the mail, so I had to open my mail with gloves, right? There were all kinds of things going on. There were, throughout the course of the trial, there were bomb threats happening. We would have our cars checked for bombs when we parked, different things like that. So all that was going on while this trial was going on. And that made, brought about that hypervigilant state, and also this idea of just trying to get through this trial with this client that I didn't want and hadn't wanted for, 2-3 years at that point.
Oh my gosh, 2 or 3 years. So there's no legal recourse. You can't excuse yourself from it. You are just, and that's the judge's mandate, or how does that work?
Sure. Back in 2011 was when I first tried to withdraw from the Arias case. And the basics of how that works is that I had to file a motion to withdraw from the case. And that was atypical because most of the time when somebody left the public defender's office, they left all the cases behind. In this case, Jodi protested. She got some lawyers working for her on her behalf, appointed by the judge. And for about 2 months, we went through the legal maneuverings, and I tried to get off her case. And, I respect the judge's decision. She ultimately decided that, I wasn't going to be allowed to get off the case. And anybody who followed the case knows it's probably a conservative estimate to say I made 10 to 15 motions to withdraw over time. And all those motions were denied. So that's why I call my books "Trapped with Miss Arias," because
I was just gonna say,
I truly was.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the two titles, and there's the book 1, and it's "Trapped with Miss Arias," and then parts 2 and 3. Now that just came out, or is about to?
No, that came out maybe about a week ago now.
So it's about a week. What are days right now?
Yeah, it came out in April. In April, yes, in April of 2021, for whenever people are listening to this. But yes, that's when it was released.
Okay, so "Trapped with Miss Arias." Yeah, I'm thinking that as you're talking. And so, do you literally mean with her, or do you mean with the whole case and the whole situation, or both?
Well, I guess I originally think about it with her, but certainly it's equally as applicable to the entire situation and the hoopla she, created in the courtroom as well as outside the courtroom.
Yeah, so it seemed like she wielded power as a defendant. Would you agree with that statement, or tried to?
Well, it depends on what you mean by wielding power.
I guess influence. It seemed that she had influence on the chain of events. You're staying on messages to media. It just felt like she had a presence in it, whereas sometimes I think defendants don't. They're silenced in some way. She just seemed to get messages out.
Well, I guess, it goes back to maybe a little bit of what we were talking about earlier regarding, the media covering trials. Because one of the things I talk about in my book is, in April 2011, after everything's all over, and I'm, trapped with Miss Arias as her attorney, I detailed the story about how she basically said, "I'm going to ruin your career if you don't do what I want." Now, I didn't, I wasn't willing to concede to that threat, but this touches on what you were saying, because while a lot of criminal defendants might make that threat, they go, I'm going to call your boss. I'm going to tell the judge you stink as a lawyer. I'm going to tell him you're terrible and I don't want you, blah, 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 right? It ends there. But unlike most defendants, Miss Arias' case and the publicity involved allowed her to have that kind of access, right? She had a Twitter account.
Right.
She had, who knows how many accounts she had, social media. She was selling artwork online throughout the process. And she had, the jails in Maricopa County at the time allowed her to do interviews. So she did interviews and she talked to people and a plethora of things, like I said, outside the courtroom that allowed her to wield power and, do her best to make good on some of the threats she made against me, as well as just overall, disparaging my work and my character she's continued to do over the years.
Yeah, I guess that is exactly what I'm talking about. That is crazy that she had access, I guess, to these methods of communication. It doesn't usually I feel like there's somebody on the outside working with it, but that she could do some of the interviews is really very surprising. Is that still in effect, do you think? I wonder if that's changed.
Well, the prison, I know that the Arizona prisons do not allow for it. And, we have a new sheriff in town. It sounds like an old Western, but we do have a new sheriff. And I don't know what his policy is on that, because I've been gleefully outside the practice of law for enough years that I don't know.
Yeah, that's
what his
kind
policy is.
Refreshing, and you don't need to. It's
yeah.
So, what year is it that? Forgive me, I'm getting the years a little bit muddled. So, when did the first jury become deadlocked on her death penalty sentencing?
Sure. It was in mid to late May of 2013. I remember it was abutting my annual Memorial Day trip to Las Vegas. So it was right up against that time when the jury hung.
Okay, so they're going at it. They're trying to figure it out, and they come back. It's a hung jury, and that means a mistrial. So you have to do this again?
That means we had to do the sentencing portion again.
The sentencing.
There's a lot of confusion about that either, too, because once a death penalty case is really a two-phase process. It involves one jury. The jury determines guilt or innocence first, and if that conviction relates to first-degree murder, then they make the decision whether or not that person is to be sentenced to death or life, and that has to be a unanimous decision under Arizona law.
Right, and it wasn't unanimous. I think it was 8-4, maybe, and 8 people leaning towards it. Do you get any intel from the jury on what the qualifications were, what the hang-up is, why they were not able to all agree, or do you just get the verdict and then it's moving to the next phase?
You get the verdict and it's moving to the next phase. Okay. Because keep in mind, and that sort of thing, like mitigation is anything. So it could be anything to any of those 4 jurors why they felt like Miss Arias didn't deserve to die, and those same factors may or may not translate to the next jury.
Okay, so the intel doesn't really have significance necessarily. It could, but it might.
There's not really intel anyway. It could, but not necessarily, because you're talking about 12 new people with 12 independent backgrounds, right, who are ultimately going to be tasked with making that decision again. And what could be life-saving to one juror may be, condemnation to another. So.
Right. Okay. So you go through sentencing again, and she ends up getting life. What's the exact sentence?
Sure. The jury hung us to sentence again. So under Arizona law, the state only gets 2 bites at the apple, and thus it defaulted to a life sentence. And then the judge is tasked with determining, and only in the most technical sense, because there's no mechanism for early release, but the judge is tasked with determining whether or not a person is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole or life with the possibility of parole. And about 5 years ago now, on April 13th of 2015, that's when Judge Stevens sentenced Miss Arias to life without the possibility of parole.
Okay, so that sentence happens, and what are your thoughts and feelings? I mean, in that exact moment.
People are going to find this so funny, because people thought I was so invested in this trial on a personal level. I was glad to be done. I was glad to save her life on a professional level. But like one of the things I said when I stepped out of the courthouse and knew that on the day of that sentencing verdict was that there's no winners. Like, this was a big tragedy. I mean, a beloved young man lost his life, and a young woman, maybe with some mental health disorders, gave up hers and is going to spend the rest of her life in prison. So there's no victory in any of it to me. So sentencing was just just a formality at that point in its most realistic terms.
So definitely not a victory. I think that that's well said and totally understandable. But was there a relief? Did you feel like you could breathe easier?
Well, you think about it. If you go back to my history with this case, and really kind of in late 2010, knowing where this is going, and in 2011, trying to get off the case. And when I couldn't get off the case in 2011, thinking, okay, well, it's going to be over by spring or summer of 2012. And then I can build my private practice. And then, May of 2013, right? I'm seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. I'm finally going to be done.
Yeah.
And then I wasn't, right? So it was such a moment of relief, because then I knew, actually it was April 15th, she was sentenced. I made a motion to withdraw from the case. I didn't want to file her notice of appeal. I didn't want to do anything. And it was granted. So on April 15th, I was finally done. And it felt really freeing and liberating. But at the same time, what was strange is that I didn't have the desire to start building my practice the way I did, 4 years ago when I left 4 years prior, I guess, when I left to start to build it. I just didn't have that desire within me anymore. And I attributed it to burnout and took some time off.
I was just going to say, you must have been burned out. How sad. Well, I don't know if you view it as sad, but just that you had this vision for your private practice, and then the time comes and the space opens up and you're just like, I can't. But you do decide to write a story. Where in the timeline does that kind of start bubbling inside of you?
Sure. So in April 2015, obviously she's just sentenced. There's media requests, there's media interest, et cetera. And there's a lot of people, if you remember, if you follow the trial, I lost over 80 pounds between trials, working out and dieting and lots of things like that. So I was like looking at what I want to do, and I'm a bit of a workaholic by nature, but it was like, okay, I'm going to write this diet book. I'm going to take some time off. Like I say, burnout. I had no desire to practice law. So I thought, okay, this is a perfect time to just take a couple of months off, spend it with my wife. We did some bucket list trips off to Cooperstown and Kansas City and different places. And then when we were about ready to go to Seattle, I'd been writing, a little bit for my own therapy, if you will. I find writing very therapeutic, and I've been writing some things that you see in the book prior. But in August of 2015, I discovered that the lymph node in my armpit was inflamed. And that was right before we were making our last trip of the summer up to Seattle, where I grew up. And my plan was, even though I wasn't inspired to do so, without any real alternatives, I was going to go back and open up my law practice again after the Labor Day weekend, or be more diligent about it. It just starts to cool down in Arizona. College kids come in, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But that lump in my lymph node turned out to be stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which meant 6 rounds of chemotherapy and only gave me a 70% chance of survival, which is pretty good. It's better than 2%. But when you're in that situation, you tend to obsess on the 30% more than the 70%.
I can only imagine.
So in writing that book, stepping back a bit, talking about the interviews beforehand, I'll refresh everyone's memory that in May of 2013, when the jury had found Miss Arias guilty of first-degree murder and was deliberating her sentence, Miss Arias did an interview in the bottom of the courthouse. And during that interview, she made the assertion that it was my idea, as the boss of the defense team, using her words, to make up or to assert the allegations against Mr. Alexander that he was an abusive pedophile, which wasn't true. It wasn't my assertion, right? So, but that assertion obviously brought a lot of, threats to my life, or led for that potential to do that. At the time, I thought, okay, I'm going to clear it up in a couple of weeks because she'll be sentenced, what have you. The hung jury precluded me from doing that. In the meantime, in 2014, she was filing motions talking about my incompetence, they go online and then she has them sealed so they can't really be talked about. And she has a private investigator she's hiring. And this guy is going on TV saying that I didn't do my job in defending Miss Arias and all this stuff. All not true. So, and in the summer of 2015, I was going to let those things pass. But when death became a realistic possibility, I wasn't willing to let those things pass because I knew my client had a propensity to butcher the legacies of the deceased men that anger her, right? So what I decided to do then is respond to her lies, to impose truth upon her lies in a way that I could do from beyond the grave, if you will, that my words would outlive me, the book would outlive me like any book would, right? So while I was going through chemotherapy, I made it my mission to write Trapped with Miss Arias, the part one, and I did it one part because that's all I could get out while I was going through chemotherapy, and I wanted to be able to defend that book through interviews and the like. And so that's what I did. I made it through. I just powered through, wanted to impose truth upon her lies. And in November of 2015, I should know that. But then that's when I published the book Trapped with Miss Arias.
Wow. So
and those were the reasons I did it. And I specifically, if you read the book, or when people read the book, they're going to see that I said, hey, I don't want to go into that because that's privilege. But there's something in the law called the sword and shield doctrine, meaning a client can't disclose something about the representation that would be privileged and then hide behind a shield of privilege when the attorney responds.
Got it.
And in my mind, that's exactly what Miss Arias did by saying I made up this stuff, that I wasn't doing my job, etc. So I responded in that regard, limited prospect with that idea in mind.
Got it. I mean, is that a loophole to being able to break the privilege in a way?
It's not a loophole. It's the law. I mean, it's the Supreme Court says, and they actually labeled it the sword and shield doctrine. If a client goes out and exposes details of the case and does it to attack the attorney, then the attorney isn't bound by privilege.
Got it. That's really good information for people to know.
On those issues.
Yeah. But it sounds like, you didn't want to write it as much as you needed to. I mean, it sounds like a real conflation of both things being necessary for your ability to move on, for your healing. Would you say that it was a necessity in a way for you?
Well, I think it was certainly therapeutic for me, because you think about it at this point in time now, I'd been Miss Arias' lawyer for 5.5 years, having to deal with her and not wanting to, right? And you think about what that brought into my life, the death threats, all those things, the inability to start my private practice, all those things. And then, by 2015, right, when this is all over, and this is, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier with cameras, this is a worldwide phenomenon, and I'll keep it PG-13, but my name was Mud, right? I was a bad guy. I was vilified based on the assertion she made in court, the wrongful belief that I believed what she did, and the belief, if people wanted to believe Miss Arias, and most people did because they were looking for reasons to hate me more, the idea that it was the defense was of my creation. So, yeah, I mean, what kind of, I do a one-man show now that has been put on hold because of current circumstances, but I call it Overcoming Jodi Arias because that association will always be with me, and that's something that I need to overcome, because no matter what I do, no matter how many shows I do, the same number of eyeballs won't be on me as were on me back then. And, going back to one of your initial questions, you said, people are going to associate me with that. That's right. If you said that, if you went and said, hey, what do you think of that guy that defended Jodi Arias? you probably wouldn't get very many flattering comments, right? And because of those misperceptions. And so, yeah, it meant something to me in life, but also, like I say, with the potential of death to impose truth upon those lives.
Sure, sure, for a legacy. And, during this, did you have the support of your family and a close community around you? Because I would imagine it's just so demoralizing. That's a long period of time, 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically a normal case. I certainly had, supportive friends and family around me. It was basically a normal case until January 2nd, 2013, when the camera started rolling. And I certainly had the supportive friends and family then too. But, it was also an all-encompassing situation, going out to dinner, if you see footage from the trial, I'm 6'3" and I've got a shaved head and I'm overweight, right? And so it was pretty easy to recognize. And I was on TV all the time, right? I'd turn on the local news at 5 a.m. when I woke up. There I was. I'd come home. There I was. So people were just saturated with me, and that, led to more hypervigilance and led to a more of a need, I guess, to kind of clear my name, the wash away the stain she imparted on my life.
Some people who get a cancer diagnosis believe there's a connection between stress and toxins and toxicity. Are you someone who would think and believe and point to perhaps that stress you were under for so long contributed to your health?
Oh yeah, I knew that right away. I consider myself pretty heart-based and a spiritual type person, and I knew right away in my heart that the stress involved of representing her on the stage that I was thrown onto was the reason that cancer entered my life.
Wow.
No doubt about it.
And so your treatments were successful and you're healthy now?
Yeah, I went through my 6 rounds of chemo. Nothing I recommend. Yeah. In February of 2016, I was considered in remission. In November of 2015, when I was halfway through it, that's when I came public with my battle, in hopes that I would inspire, some other people that are in the fight as well. And for, the last 4 years now, I've gotten scans every February, and I had one just recently, a few months ago, obviously. And that came back that I was still in remission. So I'm hoping that next February, when I hit the 5-year mark, which is when the doctor tells me he can declare me cancer-free. So I'm, keeping my fingers crossed for that for, another 10 months, I guess.
Yeah, I'll do that with you. That's great news so far. I'm really glad to hear that.
Thank you.
Okay, so book number 2 is parts 2 and 3. And forgive me, I haven't read fully the books, and I'm going to, but this transpired quickly, and I wanted to talk with you, and I want this to come out, not too far from the book release. But I've read that you offer a different possible scenario of what might have happened the night Travis Alexander died. And you might not want to give that away. If it's in the book, you might want to point people to the book, which we will. But is there anything you can share on that might give us some insight?
Well, I will direct people to the book, not just as a way of driving sales, but because I think it's rather complex. But what I will say is that I think the theory that I posit in this book explains a lot. It's certainly something that I don't think a lot of people have thought of. I certainly haven't seen discussion of that type. And I think it's going to surprise some people, because one of the things I described in my first book is I could never wrap my head around, and there's not always logic associated with murder, but I could never wrap my head around the idea that somebody who was on this, this mission, right? The state's theory was she was on this covert mission driving from Wairika, California to Mesa, Arizona, would, spend so many hours at the person's house when they were set to be somewhere. when they were scheduled to be somewhere else, rather. So, that's the kind of thing that my current theory kind of explains.
Interesting. Okay. I like that bait, I guess, or dangling. I definitely want to read more about it. And I'm sure it is complex, but you, more than anyone, have such a front seat to all the different facets and elements to that case. So I think you're uniquely positioned to share that theory, and I am looking forward to reading it all. You said something in passing about her mental health, and I read that there was a psych evaluation of Miss Arias during the trial. At what point was that done, and were you aware of the results? And how do you think it's impacted her behavior? I mean, it seems, I know you're a legal expert and not a psychological one, but it seems there's truly some, I don't know if they're visions of grandiosity or what she's suffering from, but when did you learn what her diagnosis was, and what was it, if you can share?
Well, sure. And because, I'll share what came out at trial, right? We had a couple of experts on the defense side opine on their theories that she suffered from PTSD and had been a victim of domestic violence. The state's doctor had diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder.
Yes. Okay.
And there was testimony about both those issues was presented to the jury.
Okay. And did that ring true? Does that explain some of the behavior, the borderline, do you think, in terms of manipulation or ways she interacted with you and other people?
Well, one thing that people maybe don't understand is that there's a difference between traits and a diagnosis.
Okay.
To be, and while I'm not a psychologist, my understanding from my attorney days, and I do have a diagnostic manual in my office, and definitely did when I was working as a capital attorney, that a diagnosis of a disorder has to show onset before the age of 18.
Huh.
And so, but behaviors can be that one can have a behavior. For example, one could have brain damage and a low functioning IQ, but there would not be a mental retardation diagnosis because it would be brain damage result of a head injury. They weren't diagnosed as being, say, mentally retarded at a younger age.
Okay.
So that's a significant distinction. But, let's put it, how should I say this? I'm not in a position, and I'm no longer in a position to have to defend Miss Arias. So I certainly won't take issue with many of the diagnoses that were made during Miss Arias, during the trial.
Fair enough. Okay. That's satisfactory. So the book.
Well, I'm glad I passed.
I know, like I'm some authority here. I just, I was curious, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
So when the book comes out, you've gone through treatment, the book is out, and the bar takes issue with it. And I thought maybe you were fully just disbarred, but it doesn't seem it was that simple. It was not cut and dry. It seems there was a suspension, and then you actually walked away. Can you sort of talk about that time and the response to you putting your story out there?
Sure. After I had published the book, there was a bar complaint filed by Miss Arias through some civil attorneys she hired. The bar complaint detailed what was in my book, but it also made assertions that were vastly untrue. And these things were presented to the bar. And I through my attorneys, made my case as to why I had not violated any of the ethical rules. And I don't know how much of a taint some of Miss Arias' more salacious allegations, for example, she claimed that I had blown up nude photographs of her and placed them on my office wall. That I had used nude photographs of her as a screensaver on my computer, that I, obsessed with the sexual nature of her case, all these things, but which now I see as her form of attack, right? She made spurious allegations against Mr. Alexander. So I see,
Right.
we've started to see a pattern there, right? But that being said, the bar took issue and wanted to suspend me for 4 years. And at that point in time in my life, and this is, like late summer, early fall of 2016, and I'm really cognizant of the promise I made to myself, because when I found out that I had stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, in my late 40s, I went to a dark place, and I really wondered within myself whether I was going to go through the chemotherapy. I
Hmm.
mean, you think about what my life was at that point in time. I'd been, publicly humiliated, if you will, thanks to Miss Arias's chosen defense. I'd been publicly bashed, cancel culture, right, where they call it. I'd been vilified. My name was always going to be associated with her. And did I want to keep going? Could I rebuild my life after all of that? And was I going to go through cancer to wind up in the same position that I was in years prior? So in making the choice to go through the chemotherapy, I made the choice that I wanted to live my remaining days in a different way than I had my first 40 something years. So part of that meant not practicing law anymore. So when the bar got to the point where they said, we want a 4-year suspension, and we said no, we were to the point where we were going to go to court, and a judge would decide if I had violated privilege or not. At that point in time, cognizant of that promise to myself, I said, no, I want voluntary disbarment. I want the judge to, accept my, take away my bar card, take away my privilege to practice law. I didn't want it, because I didn't want that scapegoat, if you will.
Yeah.
I wanted to build a new and different life, and I didn't, safety net would have been a better word. I didn't want that safety net to be an issue for me to come into play, to kind of go, well, I can't rebuild my life as a motivational speaker, so I'll just hang out a little while longer and, start practicing law again. I didn't want that. That wasn't the time that I fought for when I was in the chemo chair. So around that time, like I say, I asked for the disbarment, and it was granted. And it was a great day. It sounds funny, but it was a great day. After 15 years, I was done.
Yeah, it sounds like it to me. It actually makes more sense, hearing you tell it than maybe when I read it on paper. It seems truly like you had a transformational experience when you were diagnosed, and in processing what happened with the Jodi Arias case and your life and your mortality. And that it's like, it's sometimes when you discover some truth, you be betraying yourself to go back or to make a compromise. And it sounds like you just were unwilling to do that. So I really respect that. I'm sure it's been hard. You were probably giving up a career and livelihood earlier than you anticipated. So what then happened, and what was in front of you?
Well, sure. A lot of growth was in front of me, a lot of change, a lot of desire. And that's when kind of settled on writing a little more. I enjoyed the therapeutic effect of writing trapped in this area. And what I did is I took, everything that I had been through and wrote a book called Defend Your Greatness. And just kind of talking about, because one of the things that I think is relevant to my story, if I could cast that relevantly upon myself, is the idea that we all just need to stand up for ourselves and live the life that we want to live. And we don't often do that for a myriad of reasons.
Mm.
And that was something that came to me through my cancer diagnosis. And, I feel like Don, when I say this, my mortality became a reality when cancer came into the picture, because, you think about it, a lot of people that are in their 40s or younger, they don't think about death. That's something that's going to be 20, 30 years down the road.
Right.
Or they're going to get hit by a bus, and it doesn't matter, right? So it became a reality, and, my time on this planet became more valuable. I talk about, when I give speeches, or in my former show, I talk about living with joyful urgency, meaning understanding that your time on this planet is going to come to an end. So making the most of it, but also making happiness your beacon. And that was probably the biggest shift, making happiness my beacon and saying, not worrying about, the income or a Tesla, being an attorney, the status that comes with that, which is a lot of reasons I hear when I talk to lawyers, why they, as much as they want out, why they don't, because of some of those factors, right?
Yeah.
That I wanted to make happiness my beacon and let that guide me and serve me. And so that's pretty much what took over my life in 2016 and has been the driving force in my life ever since.
So for 2020, from here on out, would you like to be associated more with this way of living that you're describing, and the motivational speaking and the encouragement and the survivor story, and that I guess genre is not the right word, but would you rather be associated and tied to that over this? And do you think that's possible?
Yes and no. I don't think it's possible, and I would love to be associated with everything because, but that's the reality of my circumstance. Rebecca, I spent good couple years trying to run away from my association with Jodi Arias, and it just can't be done, right? There's always something popping up related to the case or what have you. And after trying to run so hard and talking to some attorneys that had been involved in infamous cases, I did a great show on Oxygen Network called In Defense Of, and I met 3 others who'd been involved in infamous cases. And I realized that I couldn't run away. And so, I decided to change up my one-man show a little bit to be called Overcoming Arias because, like I said in a recent interview, I could cure the very cancer that I survived, and it wouldn't be Kirk Nurmi cured cancer; it would be Jodi Arias' former attorney cured cancer. Everything I do will be stained with that association.
Right.
So that's why instead of calling my show Overcoming Cancer or anything else, I call it Overcoming Jodi Arias, because that is ultimately what I need to overcome more than anything, because like I say, that association will always be there.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about it differently now, and hearing you talking more, I'm thinking you're choosing then to integrate them, right? To make this kind of all be part of you and not reject it and not ignore it or deny it. It's like it's an integration, which is really the most honest way to do any of it. And you changing the narrative too, honestly, and also writing the story and just getting your story out as well. So, it's really bold, and I think it's really cool.
Well, thank you. That's why I changed it to Overcoming Jodi Arias, because, I perform mostly at comedy clubs when I did this, and I was set to perform at a comedy club because, my one-man show is meant to be funny, but it's also meant to be inspiring. Laughter gives us moments of hopes. And what I tell people is, look, I know that each one of us on this planet, everybody listening to this podcast, both of us, we all have things in our life that we need to overcome. So I figure I've overcome cancer, and Jodi Arias, you might learn it or two from me, and you might have some fun along the way. And so I do a 90-minute one-man show that has some laughter and has some serious elements and takes people through the journey of my story, hopefully in a way that gives them a great time and helps them look at the things they need to overcome in their life a little different. And that's my mission now.
That is so cool. I host a true crime trivia show, and I'm not doing any right now because of coronavirus, but it sounds like I should open for your one-man show. It's like a nice crowd breaker, like an icebreaker for the audience. And, we're really respectful, but we have fun too. I think there's room for levity even in these weird, dark subjects. And Jodi Arias is a category, I will tell you that. People do like to talk about her case. So, but anyway, that's just super cool. I love that you've done that. You've flipped the script.
That's what I'm trying to do. And instead, I always say, look, now is kind of my time to stand up to Jodi Arias, because she's she sued me, she put falsehoods and everything else, and 5 years removed now, and the cancel culture and everything I've been through, just said it's time. Yeah. It's time. It's been 5 years. It's time to let it loose, and her appeal was decided against her, and it's time to make sure I stand up to her and continue to impose truth upon her lives. And that's why I finished the trilogy that I started back in 2013, or 2015 rather, excuse me.
Awesome. And I'll link to those in the show notes to make sure everybody knows where to get them. And what's the op-ed? Where's that coming out? Where can we read that?
That is coming out in the Courier. I don't know when it's coming out, but if people start to follow me on Twitter at Nurmi Unchained, I will always, put my links up there. And
good.
I've written some stuff in the New York Daily News. People can Google if they want to hear some more of my opinions on things. But the Copper Courier is coming out soon, and just follow me on Twitter, and I'll get that link to you when it comes out.
Perfect, because I'm already following you as of today, so I will be looking for that. And Kirk, before you go, I do ask all my guests on Dialogue a question, and the question is, what is keeping you up at night right now?
Not a thing.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Well, so many of the things that keep us up at night, and I often say this, it gets a little metaphysical, but more often than not, the things we fear, the things that keep us up in life are illusions. And there's really value in work. Meaning I bet if you were to look back at your life and think about the things that you worried about, 99% of them probably never came to pass, right?
Yeah.
And even that 1% that does, did you ever say to yourself, geez, I'm glad I made myself worrying about being miserable about that, because that really helped me deal with the fact that when it arrived?
Right. Never.
No.
Yeah.
Never. So those things that keep us up at night, if we start taking them as illusions and start, and I do a lot of videos on YouTube. People can, go to my YouTube channel for a deeper explanation of some of the things I talk about. But, that's the reality of it. So, why waste time in the illusion when we can rest in the reality and not resist the occurrences that are happening now?
Beautiful. That's a really good word. And especially right now, when I think anxieties are running very high, that's a nice thing for people to think on. So thanks for that.
You bet. And it's such a great opportunity. And look, I know people are struggling. They have fears. I know there's economic issues and everything else, but there's also the reality of this is now a time for us, each and every one of us, to reflect on the lives we've built and if we're happy with those lives. Because we don't often pause to do that. I didn't think about that stuff until, I started going in cancer. I never asked myself the question, are you happy?
Right.
And that's such a great question. And it's one you have to confront yourself with to really get the answer. But now the time we have the time, we complain about our jobs when we go to them, and now we're not going to them. Maybe they weren't so bad. Or now maybe we know it was bad and I need to make a change. And this is a time to reflect on those things and hit the reset button. I put this out the other day. It's potentially a portal to a brighter future.
Yeah. In so many ways. You're right. I love that. Thank you so much, Kirk. We really killed the small talk, and I really appreciate your honesty and for your time and for sharing your story.
Likewise, Rebecca. I really appreciate it.